Have you ever heard the name Alexander the Great? Surely this name is familiar to your ears. Here are some unique facts about Alexander the Great. If we mention the name Alexander the Great, we will definitely remember his achievements in building an empire as far as the east and west. And because of this fame, most of the narrations involving Malay kings record that most of these kings came from Alexander's descendants. For example, the story of Hikayat Merong Mahawangsa, which tells the history of the country and government of Kedah. His success in combining innovative warfare tactics with his empire's development strategy caused the East and West to unite through cultural exchange. For this reason, when Alexander died unexpectedly at the age of 32, many people still saw him as having a divine aspect. However, there are several interesting things about this great conqueror from Macedonia. 1. Philosopher. Alexander is seen as having a deep interest in philosophy. And this is not surprising because at the age of 13 to 14, his father, King Philip II of Macedonia, had hired the famous philosopher Aristotle as his tutor. It is not known what happened between the two of them while Aristotle taught him at court for 3 years. However, his wise teaching is seen to have made a deep impression on Alexander's worldview, especially in matters of science, according to one myth. When the king was still the king of Greece, Alexander wanted to meet a famous philosopher named Diogenes. Diogenes, although known as a famous philosopher, had a habit of speaking harshly and sleeping in a large clay pot. The king met Diogenes on a plain and asked him what he wanted in his treasures. Diogenes answered, "Yes, yes. Please come to the side because you are blocking my sunlight." Isn't his answer rude? But this is actually a reflection of Diogenes' own philosophy, where what humans need to live is endurance. Amazed by his answer, Alexander replied, "If I were not Alexander, I would be like Diogenes." After his king's expedition succeeded in expanding his empire's influence to India, Alexander immediately stopped the expedition to discuss with philosophers there. The philosophers that the king met were Hindu or Jainist philosophers who rejected anything that symbolized human splendor, including clothing. So it was not surprising that when they met Alexander, they were without a thread covering their bodies. 2. Never lose. Throughout the 14 to 15-year period of Alexander's power expansion expeditions, he never lost a battle. This is why his tactics and strategies are still the subject of study by academic and military experts today. From his triumph at the age of 18, the king had a reputation for leading his troops skillfully in battlefields where smaller troops were sent to reach and break through enemy defenses before the enemy was ready to face their assault. However, despite the success of this tactic, the king was also labeled as reckless and not considering the virtues of his soldiers. But that does not prevent many from continuing to admire and study the strategies used. For example, when Alexander launched his campaign against the Persian Empire led by Darius III, the king directed 15,000 troops from the Macedonian phalanx using 20-foot spears called sarissas to quell the threat of Persian troops who were skilled with their swordplay. 3. His name is immortalized. During the same period, Alexander completely transformed the world of Asia and Europe, with most empires collapsing or being forced to surrender to his military might. With an infantry force of 43,000 men and a cavalry army of 5,500 men, it was the largest military expedition the world had ever seen at that time. During the period when his king crushed opposition and took control of the kingdom, Alexander established 70 new cities in different locations. And most of these places were called Alexandria or Alexandria after the king's name. All the cities named after Alexander can be marked throughout his military expeditions from Europe to India, and the most famous city among these 70 cities is the second largest city in Egypt, Alexandria or Alexandria, which was founded at the mouth of the Nile River in 331 BC. This is the location of the greatest and largest library the world has ever seen, the Great Library of Alexandria, and one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Pharos House of Fire. In addition, it is close to the site of the Battle of the Hydaspes, the bloodiest battle of the king's campaign in India. Alexander helped establish a city called Bucephala after the horse, Bucephalus, who was killed in the battle. 4. Fell in love at first sight. After successfully capturing the fort at Sogdian Rock in 327 BC, the king saw the Bactrian prisoners gathered by his army. While he was engrossed in looking at these captives, Alexander suddenly saw the face of a beautiful woman named Roxanne, the daughter of a Bactrian official. At that time, the king fell in love at first sight, and not long after that, Alexander married Roxanne. To celebrate his king's wedding traditionally, Alexander cut a loaf of bread in half and shared the bread with his wife. Several months after Alexander's death, Roxanne gave birth to the only light of their eyes, Alexander IV. 5. Fragrant. 400 years after Alexander's death, Plutarch wrote a book entitled Lives of the Great Greeks and Romans. In the book, he stated that the king's skin was so fragrant that there was no need to wear perfume on his clothes. It seems like a mess if we read it, but in reality, this is actually part of a propaganda tactic to improve the king's image, including adding elements of mysticism and divinity to Alexander. This was not something strange in ancient times, because this was also done by other conquerors and empire builders and was not exclusive to Alexander alone. And if anyone says that this element was deliberately fabricated by your authors, your answer is wrong. In fact, it was the king himself who encouraged this element to be added. The proof is, when the king visited a temple in Sheba, Egypt, Alexander declared himself the son of the god Zeus in 331 BC. 6. Gordian ties. In one myth, the founder of the city of Gordium, Gordius, tied the ropes of his cart with a most complicated and difficult knot. Whoever succeeds in tying this bond is predicted to become the true ruler of the Asian continent. So many people try, but many people come home empty. And during his military expedition, Alexander arrived in the city and heard this myth. Seeing this myth as an opportunity to increase his power, Alexander wanted to try it too. And as predicted, the king struggled to unravel the complicated knot that Gordius had created. Alexander finally lost his patience and immediately cut the bonds with a sword. This incident is like understanding Alexander's journey as one of the greatest military commanders in history. 7. Successfully recovered from various fatal injuries. Deserving of the great title because Alexander was always at the forefront. Not surprisingly, he was injured a lot on the battlefield. During his life, he had injuries to his shoulders, arms, chest, head, legs, and others. Getting shot by an arrow was nothing new either. In one incident, he was even shot by an arrow and his lungs were damaged due to this injury. After being hit by an arrow, he continued to fight before finally collapsing. His troops tried to save Alexander by breaking through the wall, which was starting to open. They then cut this arrow out of his chest. What is extraordinary about this incident is that Alexander the Great was able to recover. 8. Lead from the front. It is rare for a leader to lead his troops at the front. Alexander was always at the front of the line with trusted soldiers to be able to organize troop formations. So, their various war attacks were really Alexander's directions and ideas. Even during the Battle of Tyre, he did not hesitate to join the siege tower. Seeing this, his soldiers rushed to protect Alexander until the latter broke. This proves Alexander the Great's courage and totality in leading. 9. The mystery of the death of Alexander the Great. In 323 BC, Alexander was drunk after drinking a bowl of wine in a party. After being sick for 2 weeks, Alexander breathed his last breath. Many speculate that Alexander was actually killed by people he knew, namely General Antipater and his son, Cassander, or the king's former tutor, Aristotle. Modern historians who study the king's death are of the view that Alexander likely died from diseases such as malarial fever, pneumonia, liver failure, or typhoid fever. No matter what theory is presented, it is one of the greatest mysteries in ancient history. 10. Preserved with honey. After Alexander died, Plutarch reported that his body was preserved in Babylon first by Egyptian preservatives. Ancient Egyptologists from the Victorian era believe that Alexander's body was most likely preserved with honey to prevent the corpse from decaying quickly. A year or two after the king's death, the body was finally sent to Macedonia for burial. However, this desire was dashed when the king's body was crossed and confiscated by one of his generals, Ptolemy I, and the founder of the Egyptian Ptolemaic dynasty. Ptolemy did this because he saw who was successful in controlling it considered heir to the Macedonian throne that Alexander left behind. Thank you for following us on this episode. Don't forget to like and share this video. See you in the next video.